What's up, Dr. Swole here, MD, pro physique athlete. Today we're going to be talking about the squat, bench, and deadlift for hypertrophy. How good are they for muscle growth? These are really popular movements in the gym and you will see them featured in my hypertrophy programs. Today I'll be talking about the pros and cons of each of these lifts, and I'll be giving you some tips for you to execute them for max muscle growth. I remember starting out in lifting and getting into the squat, bench, and deadlift and just falling in love with them. I thought to myself that these are going to be the only movements I'll need for my legs and for my chest for the rest of my training career. I got pretty knowledgeable about them and learned all about beginner strength programming. And this is what I would call the beginner PT phase. You'll see a lot of personal trainers out there who are really cocky because they know how to squat, bench, and deadlift, and they think they know everything about fitness because of that. But as you gain more knowledge and experience, you'll see that there are pros and cons to each of these lifts. Let's start off with the squat. They call the squat the king of leg movements, and I think this is actually pretty well put. The main advantage of the squat is its high potential for overload, particularly for the quads. This is going to be a common theme for each of these three movements since they are heavy powerlifting moves. Heavy compound barbell movements are awesome for progressive overload for two main reasons. First of all, you have a very high overload ceiling. That is, as long as you learn good technique and you really lock into your form, you can go really heavy with enough time and training. This means that you're able to generate a huge amount of stimulus for quad growth. In terms of overloadability, the squat will trump most other movements for the quads. For example, most machine movements won't allow you to go that heavy, and single leg movements are going to be limited somewhat by stability. Since the barbell squat is such a strong, stable movement, it allows you to really go heavy. Now, the other aspect of progressive overload we need to consider is microloadability. Microloadability is your ability to add weight in small, precise increments, and it's a really important part of progressive overload. If your gym has dumbbells stocked in 5-pound increments, for example 20, 25, 30 pounds, going from 20 to 25 and 25 to 30 pounds are actually really big relative jumps. And this actually makes it a little bit harder in terms of gradual progressive overload over time. But with something like the squat, you can add just 2.5-pound plates and really make those small incremental gains over time. And these advantages of the progressive overload standpoint are going to apply to all three of our movements today: squat, bench, and deadlift. Now, the other good thing about the squat is that it has a good stimulus to fatigue ratio, or SFR. Stimulus to fatigue ratio tells you how much stimulus you're getting for the target muscle as compared to how much fatigue you're generating overall. Particularly as a beginner to intermediate, the squat is going to have a great trade-off just because you aren't that strong yet. When we look at the stimulus side of the equation, squat generates a massive amount of stimulus for your quads. From the fatigue side, squat does produce a fair amount of fatigue, and that's something we'll talk about in the cons section, but the ratio is still pretty good since your stimulus is so high. I did put a star beside this because if you are really strong and moving powerlifting numbers of weights, the amount of fatigue you generate will be limiting, and the stimulus to fatigue ratio won't be that good for a muscle growth standpoint. And this is why you don't see a lot of pro bodybuilders still doing big heavy squats as their main leg movement. Okay, in terms of cons of the squat, first of all, you get suboptimal rectus femoris stimulus. Your quads are comprised of four main muscles: your rectus femoris, your vastus lateralis, your vastus intermedius, and your vastus medialis. The three vastus muscles originate from your femur bone and then they attach at your quadriceps tendon at the knee. So those three muscles are really just involved in knee extension, but the rectus femoris actually originates from your hip bone. Since it crosses two joints, it becomes affected by what's happening at your hip. And when you're coming up from a squat, you're actually losing tension on this rectus femoris muscle, so it's not trained optimally. This means that if you really want complete quad development, you're going to want to include some type of leg extension exercise. Leg extensions have been shown in scientific research to have better stimulus for your rectus femoris. Next, with the squat, range of motion may be limited by mobility. Not everyone is able to get into that deep squat position, which is favorable. When it comes to hypertrophy, you really want to maximize your range of motion in the squat. And for some people, their ankle and hip mobility is limiting. If your range of motion is limited, one thing I'd recommend is to spend some time just sitting in a deep squat. This can be before your workout and even at random times during the day. With enough time and practice, your range of motion will improve, since doing heavy squats is basically a loaded stretch anyways. Next, for the squat, lower back and systemic fatigue can be limiting. If you've ever tried to do a heavy set of 20 reps on the squat, you'll know what I mean. Since you're using so much muscle mass, you're going to be gassed by the time you get to the end of a high rep set. Also, since the lower back is involved quite a bit in squats, it can be a limiting factor. And the problem with these is that they're going to cap the amount of stimulus you're able to produce for your quads. That means you may not be able to push the quads themselves as far as they're able to go if your lower back or your systemic fatigue taps you out first. What this means is that the squat isn't going to be a good movement to try and push to failure, and it's going to tend to do better for lower to moderate rep ranges. The 5 to 10 range tends to be a good place for hypertrophy for the squat. In terms of tips for the squats, first of all, you want to maximize range of motion by squatting deep. As we talked about before, you can actually work on your range of motion. Another tip is that you can try lifting shoes. Lifting shoes will have a heel on them, and this can help you get deeper in that squat, particularly if your ankles are limiting you. A full range of motion is going to make sure you get the most out of every rep. Now, a lot of questions come up in the squat in terms of optimal stance width and also the type of squat, like front squat, high bar squat, and low bar squat. I'd recommend that you find a stance that works for you. That is, find a foot position that's most comfortable for you and that you are strong in. In terms of front squats, high bar squats, and low bar squats, all of these are going to be great for hypertrophy, and I would recommend trying them all. Front squat tends to be a little bit more quad dominant, and the low bar squat tends to be a little bit more lower back involved. Think about rotating through these different types of squats to give yourself variation. Okay, now let's talk about the bench press. Bench press is an awesome movement for the pecs, and here's why. First of all, you get stretch under load. There's more and more research coming out now telling us that there is a benefit to having stretch under load. That is, you get particularly more benefit for muscle growth when training the muscle in its lengthened position. For the pecs, this is at the bottom of your pressing movements, and the bench press does a great job of training your pec through its full range of motion. People will argue that dumbbell presses can give you a little bit more range of motion, but for all intents and purposes, bench presses do well. Next, I really like the bench press for the chest because the pecs do well with heavy loading. The pecs tend to be more fast twitch dominant muscles, and thus they synergize really well with heavy overloaded movements like the bench press. Moving on, the bench press is also a great triceps builder. One of the big advantages of these big compound movements is the amount of muscle mass they involve. And you want to be starting out with compound movements, particularly if you're a beginner, because they give you the most bang for your buck in terms of overall hypertrophy. Finally, the bench press has a good SFR, or stimulus to fatigue ratio. Bench is overall not as systemically fatiguing as our squat and deadlift, so going heavy on the bench isn't going to impact your overall recovery as much. In terms of cons of the bench press, there really aren't many. I think it's an awesome movement overall. One thing I would point out is that it's not as good for high reps, and we talked about this when it came to squats. These heavy compound movements aren't going to be so great for going to higher reps or really trying to push to failure. If you are going to be going close to failure on the bench press, make sure you get a spotter. Please, no bench press deaths. In terms of tips for hypertrophy, when it comes to bench press, I'd recommend not bouncing off the chest. This is something you're gonna see a lot of bros doing in the gym, and it's something that I used to do when I started off with the bench press. People are basically trying to cheat the hardest part of the movement, which is at the bottom. But the thing about hypertrophy is that you're actually also losing out on your best gains. As we said, there is an advantage to train the muscle in its lengthened position, and that is in effect what you're getting at the bottom of the bench press. So you really want to make sure you're controlling the movement through the bottom and taking advantage of those gains. Now, in terms of grip width, I'd recommend finding a moderate grip width, something that works for you. But one tip is that at the bottom of the bench press, you basically want your forearms to be perpendicular to the ground and right under the barbell. This is going to make you the most biomechanically advantageous, and you'll end up being stronger. Finally, with the bench press, you want to drive through the legs, and part of this is finding a good leg position. Try planting your feet flat on the floor and then inching them backwards towards yourself while you get a bit of an arch in your back. I actually don't recommend having a big powerlifting arch for bodybuilding if your goal is muscle growth. This is mainly because you're going to lose out on range of motion. But just a little bit of an arch and a strong leg position is going to help you with overall overload. By having that tension through your whole body and pushing through the floor, you're going to be stronger and able to move more weight, and this will equate to more stimulus. Lastly, let's talk about the deadlift. The deadlift is the most controversial movement on this list when it comes to hypertrophy, so let's get into it. In terms of pros, the deadlift arguably gives you the most degree of overload out of all movements possible. This is a powerful advantage that is going to make it a solid movement for beginners and intermediates, even though it does have some cons which we'll talk about later. Even though it may have some inefficiencies, since you're able to generate so much overload, you're still going to get a lot of stimulus for multiple muscles. And this brings me to our next point, which is deadlifts give you a huge amount of muscle involved. Since you're using your upper back, lower back, glutes, and hamstrings to get the weight up, you're producing a lot of overall stimulus for muscle growth. This makes deadlifts a great pick if you are relatively short on time and can't fit in a lot of training volume. Now let's talk about cons of the deadlift. In terms of disadvantages, the deadlift has been put down by a lot of people for its use in hypertrophy. One of the main arguments people have is that they're highly fatiguing, and this largely has to do with axial loading. This does come into play with squats as well. Axial loading refers to the heavy compressive forces on your spine from doing movements like squats, deadlifts, and barbell rows. This type of fatigue is disproportionately more tiring than other forms of fatigue. And because you're able to lift so much weight with deadlifts, this effect compounds and the movement becomes even more fatiguing. Now, fatigue isn't going to be a big issue for beginner or intermediate just because you aren't lifting that much overall. So for beginner, I typically recommend that they go for the highest stimulus exercises regardless of fatigue. They're not lifting heavy enough for that to be a limiting factor, and they're just going to get more stimulus and more muscle growth overall. But for an advanced lifter, you're going to generate so much fatigue from doing a lot of heavy deadlifts that you're actually going to impact your muscle growth in other muscle groups as well. This is because you're going to be so fatigued overall that you won't be able to perform as well from a volume perspective for your other movements. So for an advanced lifter, you will have to consider this in your programming. Now, in terms of biomechanics, deadlifts do give you a suboptimal range of motion for the hamstrings. This is because at the bottom of the movement, your knees are actually bending, and this actually detensions the hamstrings to a degree. So you're not getting a great stretch on them. But since you're moving so much weight for the deadlift, you're still getting a decent stimulus for the hamstrings overall. Finally, people talk about deadlifts as a big back builder, but they're really only an isometric movement for the back. So biomechanically, you aren't really targeting your back that well. But again, since you're able to produce so much overload for the back, it is still going to be a great movement for your erector muscles, and you'll get some stimulus for your rhomboids and traps just from having to hold that heavy weight. In terms of tips for the deadlift for hypertrophy, my biggest piece of advice would be to not cheat the eccentric. A lot of people are focused on just lifting as much as possible and they'll drop the weight on the way down. For hypertrophy, this is a big no-no because you're giving up a lot of productive volume in the eccentric. By controlling the weight on the way down, you're producing a lot more work and generating a lot more productive volume for hypertrophy. Try to control your lift all the way down and actually stop at the bottom so you're not bouncing off the ground either. In terms of types of deadlifts, there's this age-old argument of sumo versus conventional. Both of these are going to be solid choices, and the one that's best for you will depend somewhat on your body proportions. So choose the one that you feel more comfortable and stronger in. But as a general rule of thumb, sumo deadlifts are going to favor the legs more because they're more hip dominant. I usually categorize the deadlift as a lower body movement, so I think sumo deadlifts will do well from this standpoint. Conventional deadlifts are going to be a little bit more lower back focused, but I will say that sumo deadlifts are not cheating. Both of these are well accepted when it comes to both bodybuilding and powerlifting circles, and they will produce great gains. Now, in terms of overall use of the deadlift, I do have to say that this still is a bit controversial when it comes to hypertrophy. I have to admit that it isn't the most ideal movement, particularly when you look at the biomechanical standpoint and when you consider how much fatigue you're going to be generating when you get strong. I do think these are going to be solid movements for beginners and a lot of intermediates, but when you get to your late intermediate phase, you're going to want to start playing around with other movements and seeing how fatigue impacts you. And for an advanced lifter, particularly if you're strong, you might want to try other variations like Romanian deadlifts, which might give you a better stimulus to fatigue ratio. For all of you avid lifters out there, do you squat, bench, and deadlift, and what are your numbers? Let us know in the comments below. If you're looking for a hypertrophy program, check out this video where I share a full program based on the upper-lower split. The upper-lower split is one of my favorite setups for bodybuilding, and it will be great for incorporating the squat, bench, and deadlift. Make sure you subscribe to the channel to transform your physique and change your life, and we'll see you next time.